is my pleasure to introduce to the show Keith Nobles. He is the author of the novel Our Dogs Did Not Bark, a politically incorrect dystopian tale. For about 15 years, he was an intelligence contractor to the intel community, so he knows a lot about national security issues. He's also been an entrepreneur and understands a lot about what's going on economically. A number of different angles I want to go at this topic of coronavirus, economic crisis, China, and more with our guests. So without further ado, let's bring on Keith Nobles here too. Jimmy at the Crossroads. Keith, how the heck are you, my friend? Good to talk with you.
I'm good. How are you, Jimmy?
You know, I'm doing pretty well myself, staying as healthy as you can in this country right now, meaning avoiding the coronavirus and doing the precautions that are recommended, so that's going well. All right, so tell us a little bit overall about your sense, especially from the perspective of someone who was involved in the national security realm of things for about 15 years, how you look at this crisis right now.
Yeah, the United States is, so far at least, excluding a few hot spots, really not doing badly with this. The president alluded the other day that there's a few places, New York, maybe California, Oregon, Washington, Louisiana, Colorado, I guess, is fifth in positive tests, I've read. So, but for most people in this country, it's not that pressing an issue from a health standpoint or from an economic standpoint. If you're in Wyoming or Montana or South Dakota or Iowa or Mississippi, life is probably going on about normal. But in the places that are hard hit, it's taking a severe toll. That being said, China appears to be moving past this quickly and recovering. Italy, the last several days, has had a decrease in positive tests. I would anticipate the United States, in all probability, is going to come out of this better than most anyone else of the major countries in the world.
Well, can I just say that I think that that's a very important point, is how we will get out of this crisis, especially economically, because you have a lot of people who are in media or politicians who are saying this is as big of a crisis economically as the Great Depression, and therefore we need to have a massive program. Some are even talking about the idea of suspending capitalism indefinitely because we have to address this crisis. What do you make of that level of histrionics in terms of the economic side of this, while at the same time acknowledging that there are a heck of a lot of people across the country who, as a result, especially of government orders to stay at home and what have you, are suffering right now, both people and businesses?
Well, I can tell you, generally that is nonsense, that the histrionics, that we should suspend capitalism, and this is, adopt another New Deal and blah, 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 blah. That's just absolute nonsense. This is a temporary situation that is in all likelihood a once-a-century event. And Italy, for example, as I mentioned, they seem to be on the right side of the bell curve now. Their new infections are decreasing. It took them, yes, hopefully, right? This is all just preliminary data, right? Just stipulate here, all the data we have in regard to this sucks. None of this is good data. But from the data that we do have, like new infections, Italy seems to be on the right side of the bell curve. And it took them about 7 weeks to go from the ramp up of the bell curve to get to the right side. So if we assume that's probably going to be true of the United States, we'll be in a similar position. That means probably 5 to 10 weeks from now, we will be on the downward side of this. I'll tell you, I have friends who have lost their jobs. I have friends whose businesses have been shut down by government decree, and it's incredibly painful for them. It's horrible. It's a horrible thing, but it is temporary. We will get through this, and we will probably be through this much quicker than people think.
On the economic,
is still planned.
Sure. On the economic side of this, Keith Nobles, we have a big discussion going on about what to do. It looks like Congress may move forward with an expansive package. Some are calling it a stimulus package, others calling it a relief package. And Democrats are saying you should just be focusing on individuals, not businesses. Republicans are focused too much on providing support for businesses. Now, I see both in what the Republicans were trying to get passed Sunday and yesterday, both individuals and businesses. I think that we need to provide some relief, and this has been my point on this program day in and day out. Providing relief to those in need, expanding the unemployment insurance program to cover furloughed workers, for example. There's real value in that, but there's also an important point to be made that we have a liquidity crisis right now in the United States, and we need to do something about it in order to keep cash flowing. Tell us what liquidity means, just kind of in basic terms, give us a refresher, and then what you think needs to be done in order to address this situation with liquidity in America. Keith Noble.
Well, the simplest way to understand liquidity is that you have the cash to pay your bills. That is the most basic definition. It doesn't matter if you're United Airlines or the local bar, that the bills that you have during this period of time where your revenue is greatly diminished, or maybe you have no revenue at all, that you can still pay the bills that you're on the hook to pay. That's really what that means. And I would support, I'm not a fan of the current system, but within the current system we have, and knowing that in the next 90 days we're not going to change this system, I think it's important the federal government makes sure that these businesses have liquidity. And I think two things I think they can go about doing that. One of which is deferring taxes and fees. So these businesses don't have to pay out of pocket now when they have no revenue to the government.
Okay, that's number one. What about the second point? It looks like we might have lost Keith Nobles here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. We will work to get him back here on the program. And I think the point that he made about deferring taxes is one that makes absolute sense, because right now, if you have no cash flow coming in and you have to pay taxes into the government, that is debilitating, to be sure. That is absolutely debilitating. And we cannot have the government taking tax revenue from companies that are not making any money. So deferring taxes certainly is one important point. Keith Nobles, are you back, my friend?
About that.
No problem. All right, go ahead again. Keith Nobles, author of the book, Our Dogs Did Not Bark. What were you saying? Point number two after the first point about deferring taxes and fees.
Yeah, deferring taxes, and like I said, the most basic thing to understand about liquidity is these businesses have cash to pay their business or pay their bills. So if the government were to introduce interest-free loans, within the current system we have now, I could live with that, and I think that would be a great idea. I think those loans to businesses should be available across the board. If you're a local bar or a local haircutting place, or if you're United Airlines. But what we do in that kind of model is you'd say, okay, interest-free loans, and until the president declares an end to the emergency, you don't have to pay the loans back, and then some program would kick in to where you would pay the loan back over whatever period of time with zero interest. I think that's a perfectly fair thing to do, because what's important here is keeping these businesses alive during this temporary crisis. Because what you want is when the crisis is over, these businesses to be alive to recall the workers. You want all the people who are servers and barbers and bartenders and all those people to have jobs to go back to when this is over. That's what's critical.
Right.
You don't want to turn a temporary crisis into a permanent crisis.
Right. No, it's an important point, but also keep in mind that a heck of a lot of companies in this country, in fact, more than half of the employers or workers work for companies that are small businesses. And small businesses often are people run by people who, they put their life savings into those companies. And the idea that you don't provide them support in this crisis that's government generated in the form, too, of interest-free loans that will eventually have to be paid back, that I think is an unacceptable view. And a lot of corporations, keep in mind, are also small businesses. So you can't just say, we're going to ignore corporations, because a heck of a lot of corporations are small businesses. But what do you make of the idea from many that if we're going to provide support, Keith Nobles, for these companies, that they should not be able to buy back their stock or put it towards dividends or CEO pay? In other words, say that there are restrictions on what you can do with money that comes from taxpayers to those companies?
So it's a loan, it has to be paid back, and I think that's an overly burdensome regulation. I think the more effective way to do this is just to make it simple. You get a loan, it's interest-free. When Trump declares the emergency is over, payment plan kicks back in. The more regulations you put on this and the more conditions, the more burdensome it will get, the longer it will take to get money to the people who actually need it. It's just, the simpler this is, the better. I mean, it's a very temporary situation. We will probably be past this in a matter of weeks. And government operating the way it does is prone to put in a bureaucracy that means people won't even get the money or the loans being available to them until the crisis may be over. Speed is of the essence here, especially for your local small businesses. So I'm not a fan of putting any kind of terms or restrictions or regulations on the money. Just make it available, let businesses borrow, and make them pay it back once the emergency is declared over.
Very interesting observations there. Keith Nobles, again, author of the book Prepare Now. Excuse me. That's another guest. Author of the book, Our Dogs Did Not Bark, a politically incorrect dystopian tale. It is a novel. See, I'm going off of memory here, Keith, so I try to keep all these pieces together. All right, let's shift gears here to national security issues. So as you know, last Thursday's show, after I broadcasted the program, Gordon Chang, noted China critic, was one of my guests. Actually, in that day, he was the only guest that we had for a shorter broadcast. That's number one. Number two, we called it China's coronavirus culpability and the Trump New Deal. And within moments after we broadcasted that show on Facebook Live, it was blocked by a copyright claim from iCable News, a Chinese television outlet based in Hong Kong, clearly a Chinese government proxy. Yesterday, after my show was broadcast on Facebook Live, Jimmy at the Crossroads, episode 007, was blocked by this Chinese outlet again for a copyright claim. Now, last Thursday, I dealt with a few hours of the video being blocked and at one point me being suspended from my page. Yesterday, Facebook responded quickly, and it was just minutes that the video was blocked. But I don't blame Facebook for this. I look at the fact that they're just following through with their own circumstances, what their policies are when you have a copyright claim, and they're short-staffed right now given this particular crisis. But what I do blame is China. Now, on the global stage, it seems to me that China is doing everything they can to blame the United States for coronavirus, even though it began in Wuhan, China. They're saying the U.S. Army was responsible for this. Now governments like Iran have been perpetuating this myth as well, or at least floating the idea, maybe, just maybe, this is what's happening. And here in the United States, they're trying, it seems to me, to block any content that may be putting forward what really happened, which is China being the first place where this coronavirus came from and the crisis began. So Keith Nobles, what do you make of that, especially as someone who for 15 years, particularly during the Cold War, was an intelligence contractor?
Well, it's pretty simple. You have a communist regime in China that is trying to prevent people with platforms such as yourself from exposing how they have behaved. This isn't rocket science. Now, Facebook has rules, and Facebook has, for example, and other platforms, not just Facebook, rules to protect them from liability for people sharing content that they do not own. Those are valid rules. Okay, but at the same time, China abuses those rules, as in your case, as we saw.
No copyright claim to speak of, for sure.
Exactly, but they claim you made a copyright violation, and Facebook has a process. They automatically take it down until they can investigate that. Now, Facebook did investigate it, restored your video. So kudos to Facebook. But, yeah, I mean, this is a common Chinese tactic to use our systems for protecting intellectual property to shut down free speech, while ironically at the same time China is stealing intellectual property from the United States left and right.
That is ironic, isn't it? Especially because it's bogus. And you know how yesterday's was especially bogus? Because the 17 seconds this time, last time it was 11 seconds, including a press conference of President Trump, video footage of that, not even audio, which by the way, is public domain. It was pulled from C-SPAN. But yesterday, it was my interview with Rick Newman of Yahoo Finance that they flagged. And it was just like, what? How in the world do you get that?
Yes, yes. And they don't care. I mean, they're bogus claims. And that's the whole goal for China. And no doubt they have bots that are looking for platforms such as yours, which may be looking to talk about what's really going on in China as opposed to what the communist government may claim is going on, and to flag them, to make themselves a nuisance, to make your life more difficult.
So I want to ask you a question. We're wrapping up here with Keith Nobles, our guest author of the novel Our Dogs Did Not Bark, a politically incorrect dystopian tale. And he was a contractor to the intelligence community for about 1.5 decades, including the last decade of the Cold War. You've been arguing that we are in a Cold War with China, that we have been since the mid-90s. Clearly, this would be an example of it, the propaganda machine in its own country and around the world, and then also here in the United States, where they're trying to block Americans who are expressing the facts about China being the place where this coronavirus began. 2 questions. Number one, why do you think it's actually important for us to call a spade and say, actually, this did begin in China, as opposed to ignoring it? President Trump is trying to highlight this. And also, what should the United States do to respond to this? Is it really just highlighting and making sure that it's known that China is where this began? The United States does not intentionally introduce this into Wuhan and what have you? Or is there something else we should be looking at, Keith Noble?
Well, so I'm a free market kind of guy.
As am I.
And the free market is going to end up addressing this. Just to look back real quickly, a little history. In the 1920s or early 30s, the Soviet Union invited companies from Europe and the United States to build factories in the Soviet Union. And in fact, Henry Ford built an auto factory in the Soviet Union. And none of that worked out for the Europeans or the Americans for many reasons, but primarily because they're communist countries. Communist countries have never existed premised on any kind of reality. They exist premised exclusively on force, and they exist on propaganda. No one would voluntarily live under a system like this. And so what's going to happen here, I think, is we're probably going to see some retraction of American industry out of China. Americans certainly want to sell into China, and it's certainly been very inexpensive and regulation-free to manufacture in China. But there's probably going to be some rethinking of this, and not just because of the virus, but because of how the Chinese government has behaved in regard to the virus. There's a lot of talk that, especially pharmaceuticals, our pharmaceutical industry is far too dependent on China. The president has said China is cooperating in that regard, and that's good. But I think there's going to be a great rethinking here about what the relationship is with China. And I don't mean just the government-to-government relationship. I mean the market relationship. We're having, and we will have, some continued disruption in supply chain here. And that's going to cause people to rethink some of that. But on a similar note, what we have found here in Colorado and nationally is a suspension of certain laws and certain regulations in this emergency. And I think when we're done with this, it's going to be a very valid question to ask, why did these laws and regulations exist in the first place if they were suspended in an emergency? And of course, the primary reason why China is more attractive to do manufacturing than the United States is our taxation and regulation regime. It's not the price of labor. It's that you can get things to market so much quicker in China than you can in the United States. And so there's a lot of things here. When we get through this crisis, that's going to be fair to sit down and reevaluate and rethink. And I certainly hope that happens. I think companies are going to be driving that.
Keith Nobles, check out his novel, Our Dogs Did Not Bark, a politically incorrect dystopian tale. As always, my friend, fascinating and great insights, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads and help make sense out of nonsense.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Once again, Keith Nobles joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Always enjoy getting his insights, fascinating on all different sides of the issues.